In The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the Lost Woods is one of the most evocative areas in all of Hyrule. Before you pass through its entrance, the world seems as it ever was. But in a moment, that changes. Particles drift through the air, and a haze comes upon you, obscuring distant sight lines and coloring the world a feather-light faded blue. The soundtrack notices the change. Airy, yet insistent piano notes creep in, neglecting to settle or resolve. They float along the air like do the particles. A rattle of wood echoes out, like the sound of scurrying things tripping the noisemaker of a trap. One note of glass swells in and lingers, without identity, only alluding to some person or thing's voice, only the ghost of a voice. As you walk onward, discernible patches of fog hang in the air, swirling heavy and slow, making the woods ahead even more difficult to visualize. The motion of the fog gives a hint of movement to the surroundings, but an illusory one. Your presence then startles a collection of dark and watchful birds. These mountain crows take to the sky, and in their absence you notice the stillness. The only of earthly noises is the wind playing gentle with the grass and other greenery. The music lingers on, like a chant, like a spell. In comes a few lower piano notes, of the same cadence, deepening its insistence of the mood. Then, too, comes a swell of breathy static, like a mistranslation between worlds. The torches before you only serve to contrast with the woods about and deepen their mystery. The torchlight flickers weak against the thick veil of wisp and tree. A few more crows flee from the path as you walk it. The amount of these birds, like nowhere else you've been, is ever so slightly disconcerting. It hints of a calling you cannot hear. Fat trees start to appear along the guideless path you walk. They have what must be described as gaping, woody mouths, made of a cavity in the meat of their trunk, wholly unnatural, and their branches stretch out frozen as like a grasping claw. The way forward conceals itself. The mists wait to pounce upon any wrong move. There is a bare almost nothingness to tell you how you're supposed to proceed. Your world is now strange. The outside world no longer exists. The only world is the one all around, very near. Yet it feels suspended and unreal, something that's not quite here. A phantom, a dream, with many an unnamed thing lurking within. Even without having walked too far, you feel you're a world away from the world you've known. That's some powerful design, and I love it. In fact, I love it so much that I want more of it, and I want the game to soak up every juicy droplet of potential out of that killer vibe. However, the game is done. It's over. I'm many years too late. But let me explain all the same. Let us dream a little. The issues I have with the Lost Woods are wider in nature than its visceral qualities. The atmosphere within it is amazing, but the physical layout of both the whole woods and one's path through the woods is simplistic, such that it contradicts the creepiness that the woods create. Standing at the double-standing torches along the entrance path, you may not know where to walk at first, but once you do know, the solution becomes very small and straightforward. You walk a bit to the south, a bit to the west, a bit back to the north, and then continue west all the way into the outcroppings of rock that opens to Korok Forest. Now this phenomenon is not surprising. Many strange riddles and puzzles seem simple upon completion. But there is more than the puzzle itself at play here. There is the brilliance of the mood. And that is something you ought not to tamper with too much, even for the sake of a puzzle or quest. There may be some other ways to do the same general thing, but in a manner that never undercuts the spookiness. If it was only a matter of the entrance path, I'd be much less critical. But this is the case with all four of the paths that one can take through the Lost Woods. If you look at the hero's path of one's journey across the map, you'll see that the route northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast are each pretty much one single line. There's no getting turned around and doubling back or anything like that. It's all pretty straightforward. There's always only one path to go. That's not very harmonious with the ethos of a place called the Lost Woods, nor with the vibe that the place has. There's actually no getting lost about the woods at all, which I think misses the great opportunity that their work with the aesthetics provides. The atmosphere of the Lost Woods is not just middle-of-the-road, unflavored creepiness. Nintendo has a much higher standard of quality than that. The woods are transcendent and dense and elusive and lurking. I really, really want the gameplay to emphasize that emotional experience, rather than to underplay it, or to some extent flat out undercut it. A simple path makes the woods feel a bit like the scenery seen while traveling down the highway. The scenery is real, but it doesn't really mean anything to you because you're just driving on by it. It's something to look at, not somewhere to be. It's superficial. When the rubber meets the road, the atmosphere of these woods is superficial too. It's real, it's cool, but that feeling of getting lost slips away the more you realize just how on rails you really are. You don't always see the rails clearly, but it becomes obvious that they're there eventually. The Lost Woods become not a place to be or get lost in, but something to look at while you're walking through. When I enter the woods at first, it feels magically unreal, like the laws of physics just might not be obeyed in this ethereal realm. It's a special kind of otherworldly. It's a special kind of creepy. I want to get that silly feeling that the woods are going to swallow me up and starve me to death as I bumble about in its maze of mysterious misdirection. I don't. It's 4 paths, and if you go the wrong way whatsoever, the game puts you back where you need to be. Let's talk about fear, the gooey center of what creepiness is. The essence of fear has much to do with uncertainty. Of course, fear also needs a sense of threat, but it is made more potent by a searching ignorance. There are many uncertainties that can heighten one's sensation of fright, such as the timing of the threat, the nature of the threat, our ability to respond to the threat, our ability to cope with whatever consequence to us that the threat might reap. There needs to be a sense of uncertainty. That's why you aren't supposed to show the audience the monster in many, if not most, scary movies. It's part of that experience of dread, when you just know something's going to jump out at you, but you don't know when. And it's what makes having one single simple path through a section of Lost Woods so damaging to the experience. So, we can brainstorm possible solutions soon, but I also have something to say about the greater region. The characteristic of uncertainty can express itself in many aspects of a crafted work, such as the landscape. If you can, take a look at the shape and placement of the Lost Woods on the map. It's basically a circle, a simple, understandable shape. You can, at least from the outside, pretty much see where it starts and where it ends. That makes it tangible, conceivable, an idea lacking the dark shadows of mind where fears may dwell. The simplicity of this shape may help players to not get confused. This is true. They get a clear understanding of where the Lost Wood Zone is, so to speak. The circular shape may also allow them to more easily find the right place to enter. That is certainly true. But it takes away something for sure. A forest that might grope about the terrain in a wild and unruly pattern speaks to a quality of defying one's understanding. The more complicated the shape, the more it feels like it was made to confuse and ensnare you. Confusion, to some degree, is a necessary part of truly unsettling gameplay. Again, it's about that fear-enhancing lack of knowing. You might think such a thing to be inconsequential, but there is a lot of power in just aesthetics alone. The Lost Woods are still cool and creepy, even though I know there's no getting lost, because of said aesthetics. And much of Breath of the Wild's appeal is because of its beautiful aesthetics. It really is a place, a game world, that you just want an excuse to exist in for a while. So the aesthetics of the woods are important, and the aesthetics of its layout too. A simple shape implies a controlled phenomenon. A more complicated shape might feel like the woods have a grasping and uncontrollable mind of its own. Also, a more sprawling and complicated shape for the woods would allow for a bit more anticipation. Imagine seeing the trees get denser and denser, towards some even greater density of forest beyond. Imagine, as you approach, the world gradually getting stranger, the air drifting about in patches of fog and faded colors, like the forest is creeping in about you. And imagine that sensation of not being quite sure where the forest and its magic truly starts or ends, not knowing when you're truly safe and free from it until you're well far away, and not knowing when you've actually plunged into the meat of the forest until it's too late. That's the ethos that a sprawling woods could express. It would both build an anticipation of that forest on the horizon, and also heighten the lurking, uncertain qualities that makes the Lost Woods great. So, let's talk about solutions and alternatives. Some more practical, some just for the sake of brainstorming. The first thing to get rid of / fix would be the almost instant wham-bam, foggy, zip-you-away effect that fills the screen with white and causes Link to gasp a shivering gasp before fading the screen back down onto him now looking around and standing at a previous location. This is an effective game mechanic. It's simple. It gets the player back where they need to be while creating a navigational mystery. However, it greatly deflates the mystique and intrigue. There isn't enough set dressing for the moment to stay immersive. The gameness of the game is felt quite profoundly. The ideal scenario would have the player appear back out of the woods without any clue of how they got turned around. That type of experience would emphasize a greater impenetrability to the woods, seemingly beyond understanding. Let's stay ambitious here, but start simply. There is an alternative way to do the magical fog effect. You could have the fog come upon the player much more gradually, and have the fog obscure everything in the environment, yet not obscure the player. This would allow a lot of wiggle room for the game to alter Link's position without drawing attention to it. All you would need is a split second where nothing can be seen but Link, and then you could instantly teleport him wherever you, as the game designers, wanted to put him. If done correctly, the player might not even realize. The fog billows up as many passing clouds, and just for an instant all is obscured, but the clouds keep billowing and lessen quite naturally. There may be some technical issues with this, but maybe not disastrously so. There might be an issue with performance, given both the processing of the fog effect and the rendering of a new area quite quickly. One thought is that the new area could be preemptively rendered. This usually happens behind a loading screen, but you could hypothetically do it at any time if programmed for that. It would be quite the resource draw. Maybe the render distance could be far reduced, given how obscured the Lost Woods environment looks anyways. Why bother even computing any objects or terrain that are far away? Also, some picture quality decrease could be allowed for, since much would be behind the fog. You could also use that blanket white fade effect that covers the whole screen in conjunction with the greater number of fog clouds. That way you don't have to use, and thus calculate, quite as much fog. Any way you do it, if the fog increases and decreases naturally enough, nothing will be noticed. And that is an excitingly sneaky idea. Of course, there's also the matter of lighting and sound. Link would still have a lighting that's based off of his surroundings, and if he's holding a torch or whatnot. A sudden teleportation could still be observed in Link's lighting, perhaps. Also, any sounds that are nearby might unnaturally cut off in the moment Link gets teleported. Both of these issues might be fixed by letting the lighting and sounds linger and decay more naturally. Easier said, but I imagine it doable. Another thing to note, the map should not be visible during teleportation. Perhaps it shouldn't be visible inside the forest at all. Or maybe the fog does a cool thing where it passes over top of the mini-map in the corner, just like it obscures the environment. One really fun thing about this method is that the player could run around as Link the whole time. Even as a fog cloud drifts by and teleports him, his run animation doesn't need to stop, nor the player control. This makes it feel like the world is still unfolding in an honest, even if magical manner. The action of gameplay carries on, uninterrupted, and so too would one's sense of immersion. No matter what the game and the woods are trying to do, the player still may run from it and through it. Here's another variation. How the woods work now, there are certain set places you can't step beyond without being warped away. There is the potential to loosen this up a bit. Maybe you, the player, could see some fog clouds coming, hovering in menace and intimidation towards you. Therein is a bit of randomness that might make the gameplay feel more alive and make the woods feel more intangible. The invisible boundaries as they are now could be greatly taken away, and in terms of balance, replaced by patches of fog. I don't think you'd want to get rid of those invisible tripwires completely. You'd want to safeguard players from stumbling into the Korok Forest center, if coming from a boring, uncinematic direction. Entering the main entrance of Korok Forest is a great moment you don't want to miss. Also, there's the fire and torchlight puzzle from the Lost Woods entrance, which requires some degree of unavoidable boundaries. However, some loosening up of these boundaries will allow players to become an active part of their experience of getting lost. Now, what about the possibility of not having only one single entrance into the Lost Woods in the first place? I still like the one entrance into Korok Forest, as mentioned, but the ability to get swallowed up by the Lost Woods areas has some tantalizing potential. It would allow for a more creeping presence of the landscape. It would really heighten one's sense of the unknown to not even know where a real entrance is and what could be amongst all the areas of the forest. Of course, there is the issue of players getting way too lost, but there might also be remedies. The wind and torchlight puzzle could be expanded out into the greater area, giving many paths for people to follow when entering from many different directions. There could be hints given before or within the forest to facilitate this, in the form of signs perhaps, or hopefully something less explicit, as the coolness of the puzzle is in its wordless mystery. So there could be a few lines of standing torches in various places within the woods. Each could end at double standing torches, just like how it is now, with a handheld torch hanging out nearby. This would allow one to figure out the mystery from any entrance point. However, if we want some sort of Korok challenges in the northwest semicircle of the forest, then we should not let people in there, perhaps. The lake might serve as a good implicit barrier. The water doesn't have to wrap around the landmass like it does now, but can guard like a side and a half. And then if people travel over the water and wander in anyways, maybe they get redirected via fog back out. Or maybe they get redirected via fog to somewhere on the southeast side where they can actually be successful at getting deeper in. I should also mention the paraglider, which could throw a big monkey wrench into these ideas now that we're taking out the instant fog player warping barrier. But I think the solution is simple enough. Our new style of fog could billow up as they get above the forest, so that they could be teleported to somewhere else in the forest, away from the center. This is just like I described before, but instead of being teleported from like one patch of grass to another, they are teleported from one patch of sky to another. Once the Lost Woods atmosphere descends upon them, and the faraway terrain is no longer visible, then the player can be teleported however a designer wishes, without issue. After all, once the forest has you, there's no telling what might happen. The big problem with this much extra space to explore is the problem of the efficiency of fun. An idea can be cool, but if you drag it out to be, say, twice the length that it ought to, then you've seriously impacted the fun per minute of the player experience. That's the efficiency of fun. How concisely or elegantly are you guiding players along what's on offer? How much bloat is there? How much time could be shaved off and still amount to relatively the same experience? That's my biggest worry with this brainstorming, that a player might feel bogged down by such a confusion of terrain rather than more greatly entertained. I think it's worth the risk, though, if designed with an awareness for that pitfall. One solution would be to provide unofficial warp points to the original wind and torchlight puzzle. That would allow players to get there fast enough no matter where they enter. These warp points could be triggered by some magical device, perhaps a little totem of some sort. They could activate our good old-fashioned insta-warp fog. Or maybe a warp that's something more immersive and magical. Or maybe you could have a magical archway. But I'll expand on that in just a bit. Another solution for protecting the player's efficiency of fun is to provide them with more stuff to find. I also think this to be a great potential for the location regardless. In Ocarina of Time, for instance, the Lost Woods had Skull Kid, a little mini-game area, a stonework entrance to Goron City, a hole in the ground, a meadow with strange beefy enemies that leads to a temple. There should be secrets to stumble upon. I would like to feel like there's little hidden nooks where strange things or creatures might reside, where things might have been lost for years uncountable. I say, put some of that stuff in the Lost Woods, for people who might not go right to the entrance. I think it would be real fun and super evocative for the vibe. Okay, now we move on to advanced shenanigans. I don't know that these next ideas could have been implemented, even if tried. It was Breath of the Wild on the Nintendo Wii U, you know. Also, I'd like to explore these ideas on their own in some essay at some point. So, given that, I will try to keep this as brief as I can. Let's call it a bonus round. First up, we have the notion of duplicated terrain. Multiple patches of the Lost Woods could be designed to have the exact same look and geometry, spread out and placed at different locations. This way, the player could be teleported instantly and not even notice the difference, since, well, there wouldn't be one. The non-duplicated terrain, which might give the trick away, would be far enough out of sight as to not be seen, at least in this method. Using this method would also mean that you don't need a huge obvious billow of fog to disguise a teleportation. It would probably mean hiding the minimap information, but perhaps not, depending on the terrain orientation and size of duplicated sections. The trickiness of this method is so freaking cool. You, the player, would feel like you are exploring the woods like normal, and yet have no idea how the woods turned you all around. That's the true spirit of getting magically lost. Let's talk a sec about how to actually do this, though. There are some glaring issues. Firstly, the game doesn't usually have two separate areas loaded in simultaneously. All games tend to load in and render only the things the player needs to see. The limitations of performance is always a raging battle. Also, even if you do have two separate areas loaded in, there may be an amount of randomness that makes the two identical areas slightly different. The example that comes to mind is the motion of the grass. So you not only need to have two different areas loaded and seamlessly rendered one into the next, but also they need to be perfectly synced up. Otherwise, lots of little differences would make the transition quite ugly. Now, perhaps some of that would be easy to implement. Let's consider the grass again. You might be able to have location number 2's grass get its coding instructions from location number 1's grass. Then, once Link gets teleported, the wind of location number 2 could gradually take control from the grass's previous velocity. I don't know the specifics of the systems in play, but something like that might be possible. Also, both locations might be easier to render than the vistas the game is used to rendering, thanks to the fog. There's the thick and obvious fog that teleports us, and then there's the less obvious, more atmospheric kind of fog. The atmospheric fog obscures faraway distances, giving a designer the great opportunity to cut back on the amount of terrain the game has for to calculate. Now, I know grass can be very taxing on performance, so maybe this isn't as clean-cut as I would like. I'm ignorant of the development specifics, but it might help. So that's the synced up way to transition from one location to another. But another method comes to mind. That is of a split within the programming of the game's camera itself. You would have a view of location number 1 and a view of location number 2, both running within the console. But the camera would display a precise composite made up of only some parts of each. You would not see all of either location. What you would see is of a seamless splicing of two different locations looking like only one location. You wouldn't even know that you were looking at two different locations. As long as the geometry is the same at the place where the two locations are divided and spliced together within the camera, then all is well. You wouldn't be able to tell. Link, when he walks across this border between, would be teleported instantly from location number 1 to location number 2, but he would be teleported seamlessly without changing his animation, just his XYZ location. It would be meant to look like nothing has happened at all. And as soon as the location number 1 is no longer within the scope of this composite camera, then the camera can go back to showing only a single location, i.e. location number 2, the location that Link has now secretly been teleported to. I wonder about the technical challenges for programming this. You wouldn't technically need to render all of either location, so maybe that would help matters. And you can gradually render in location number 2 as it draws closer and closer from behind the foggy horizon. Though perhaps designing a composite camera would be a tricky thing all the same. Or maybe it would be a performance tanking sort of thing. I know these things are in theory possible. If you can dream it, you can make it. But especially for the game and gaming system of which we speak, these are more like fun ideas than confident proposals. But let us touch on two layout ideas before I wrap up. First is the notion of another realm, totally separate from the regular Hyrule map. You could use specific borders made to match up in order to transition Link across to this other realm. Or you could use duplicated terrain, which would have copies in both the regular map and this special Lost Woods map. Then, you as the game designer could lay out this realm in whatever configuration you wanted, with whatever content you wanted, and connect different locations of the Lost Woods together however you wanted. The outmost border of this other realm could loop back around using the previously discussed teleportation methods. In that way, you would not need a definitive borderline. Go west long enough, and you would end up in the east. Go north for a jog, and you would end up in the south. I don't know if a different realm really provides much benefit, but it's an intriguing variation on how to implement these ideas. After all, there's something enticing about the in-between space of a spiritual realm. Secondly, there is the many possibilities of our split camera method. An example that jumps to mind is of walking past a pair of trees. Let's say that Link is in a location number 1. But as Link walks past these two trees, the space between those two trees shows a location number 2. Now in this example, location number 2 is not identical to location number 1. The space between these two trees is like a special window into another part of the forest. Outside of this tree gap, everything looks like location number 1. Peering through the tree gap, location number 2 makes itself seen. If Link decides to walk through the tree gap, he travels seamlessly to another location within the Lost Woods. And if he walks too many paces, and the camera can no longer see location number 1, then his teleportation will be complete. When he turns around, there will be no evidence of the location number 1 that he was just in. There will only be the slightly different surroundings of location number 2. Perhaps just similar enough, but just different enough to create a special sense of unease. The possibilities with the camera split method are ever-flowing. So, there ends the bonus round. With this episode, I hope I've inspired you to dream a little further. I love the Lost Woods. I'd have loved to have seen it brought to its full potential. Perhaps in a later installment. There is always more to invent. Hopefully it can become a location that actively embodies its aesthetic, in function, layout, and game mechanics. I want it to be more than just its awesome set dressing. It's a special and spooky place. I long to feel that odd sensation that whispers the woods might swallow me up for keeps. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to reciprocate financially, you can do so via my Patreon. There's a link in the About section of my channel.